Good afternoon, everyone. We are the Group 1, and our topic is State and Societies from 1764 to 1898. And the coverage of our topic are the imperative to reform, the new economy, reforming the state, and social formation and state response. So the first one is the imperative to reform. The growth of British influence as well as the temporary fall of Manila exposed the state's weaknesses in defense and population management. The Spanish state was unable to stop the illegal entry of commodities. The galleon trade had begun to lose money as European merchants and smugglers took advantage of British Navy's maritime peace to deal directly with China. Spain's American empire collapsed to a few Caribbean islands, and how ironic it is that the imperial periphery addressed the issue of establishing a modern colonial administration and economy at the same time that the empire was losing ground. Both customs revenue and the Philippines' commercial reason for existence were lost, and in order to survive, they were compelled to undertake economic and financial reforms. The development of Philippine agricultural and mineral resources was the natural substitute for the galleon trade. This development resulted in the discovery of more valuable resources, and this opened up new markets for raw materials. The goal was to construct a cohesive colonial economy out of the separate Indio, Chinese, and Spanish sectors, and to modernize the state in order to promote and benefit from these changes.
Bagong Pilipinas, bagong muka. Mga kawaywan, pag-usapan natin ang tungkol sa new economy. Sobrang importante ng topic na to, so please, huwag niyo akong tutulugan. Magsimula tayo sa export agriculture. Meet Governor General Jose de Basco y Vargas, isang economic-minded governor na dumating sa Pilipinas noong 1778. Siya lang naman ang nakakita ng potensyal ng ating bansa for large-scale production of cash crops for export. Pag sinabi nating cash crops, ito yung mga crops produced for commercial value. He tried to encourage local manufacturing to limit the silver drain. Pag sinabing silver drain, may nagaganap na transfer of money from Europe to pay for the luxury products of the East. Noong 1785, he established the Royal Company of the Philippines para may source of funds siya for his projects and for his vision na makipag-trade sa other countries. Sadly, nagkaproblema siya sa proposals niya. Kinontra ng friars ang changes sa labor force. Kinontra siya ng mga taong interesado sa galleon trade, yung mga nakikinabang. Kaya, yung Royal Company, it failed to introduce new skills and scientific knowledge lacking in the friar-dominated educational curriculum. Pero kahit rejected ang proposal ni Basco, may mga accomplishment pa rin siyang nagawa. He canceled the ban on Chinese merchants na nag-lead sa pagbabalik ng internal trade. Sa internal trade, dito pumapasok ang GDP o Gross Domestic Product na malaking tulong sa ating ekonomiya. Pag sinabing GDP, gawa dito sa Pinas. Pilipino ka man o foreigner, basta dito ginawa sa Pilipinas, counted yan as GDP. He established the tobacco monopoly, naka-tax form. It is a government auction right to produce, sell, and or operate a monopoly. Successful ang tobacco monopoly. The state had an advance payment on an annual basis at nakapag-remit pa ng revenue sa Spain. Naging major manufactured product for export ng Pilipinas ang cigars. The clearing of forested land for tobacco gave way for other commercial crops, especially abaca and sugar, to be cultivated in interior and mountainous regions of the monopoly. Road to bankruptcy na ang galleon trade in its last 2 decades, kaya when it ended, nawala ng control ang Spain sa Philippines foreign trade. Yung galleon trade kasi, it's the sole means of communication between Spain and its Philippine colony and served as an economic lifeline for the Spaniards in Manila. Royal Company was abolished. Nagbukas ang Manila for trading and residence. Welcome ang kahit anong nationality. Nawala ang discrimination against Chinese ships trading. Same taxes and procedures na ang lahat ng ships, even yung mga nasa posisyon. After a decade, nawala ang trading privilege nila. In 1778, Basco allowed the Chinese to return, but limited to necessary 4,000 population. Parian was reestablished and capitation tax was imposed. Ang capitation tax, ito yung tax na uniform lahat despite the occupation or income. In 1830s, naging priority na ang economic development. Policies changed to encourage the immigration and eliminate restrictions on movement. New immigrants initially faced competitions from Chinese mestizos who had taken up wholesaling and provisioning urban areas during the previous century. New immigrants linked provincial producers to the world market through combination of well-placed agents and credit from Western commercial firms. Kaya yung mga Chinese, kahit maliit lang ang own capital, nakakabuild ng business. Kasi pwede namang utang. Good debt, kumbaga. The firms also convey demand information from foreign markets, guiding producers' planting decisions, which is a key factor in the development of sugar plantations. Basco's ideas were eventually realized during 1840s since almost 90% of total export revenue came from 6 Philippine-grown cash crops, which was his idea and is much higher than the exports equivalent to less than 10% during the last of the galleon trade. During 1822, Manila's population is 100,000, pero by mid-century, naging 150,000 dahil sa migrasyon. Open kasi tayo sa foreign traders. Marami ng dayuhan ang pumupunta sa Pilipinas. May iba't ibang rason kung bakit nagmamigrate ang isang tao. Halimbawa, gender disparity, o kaya ay opportunities. Kagaya ng karamihan sa atin, we're from other provinces or regions, pero mas pinili nating mag-aral dito sa Las Bañas. Before we proceed to the next topic, paki-picturean pala ng mabilisan yung next 3 slides. All right, lalakayin naman natin ang importance of land. Alam natin kung gaano kahalaga ang pera. At kung napapansin niyo rin, ang population kada taon ay tumataas. Mahirap kontrolin. Malaking epekto ito sa mga magsasaka. Kaya naman ay pinili nilang mag-export ng mga produkto nila para magkapera. Ano ba ang usual na naiisip ng mga tao kung walang pera? London. Loan dito, loan doon. Sa panahon noon, may tinatawag na Pacto de Retroventa o Agreement of Repurchase. Parang sangla, binenta mo yung lupa mo pero pwede mo bilhin at the same price. Pero mahirap mabili ulit kasi pag may utang, may interest. Bilang diskarte at nang may masaka pa rin, most families stayed on as sharecroppers or tenants. In this way, the evolving colonial elite used the capital earned in retail trade to accumulate the best land for export crops and a labor force to which it was linked by kinship or by networks of personal relationships. Accumulation also occurred through land grabbing, often by the powerful religious orders. Friar states simply demanded rent on land they wanted or conducted fraudulent land surveys. The Indio mestizo elite earned considerable wealth without doing a stroke of work. Ganyan ka-unfair ang sistema noon, kaya maraming nawawala ng lupain. Yung ibang lupain na pinaghirapan from generation to generation, napasa kamay ng mga namumuno, kaya napipilitan ng mga tao mag-migrate o magsilbing labor. Lack of technology din ang problema sa panahon noon, kaya hindi ganon kabilis ang produksyon at wala pang lakas ng loob ang mga Pilipino para ipaglaban ang nararapat na sa kanila. If ikukumpara natin sa panahon ngayon, ang panahon noon, kung uso ngayon ang notaryo at pagbabayad ng tax, sa panahon noon, hindi. Walang legal papers, walang land title, kaya no land improvement. Halos lahat pagmamayari ng Spanish state. Paki-picture ng next slides for additional info. The new economy unified the colony only in the formal sense that it produced Philippine products. This patchwork of diversity prevented communities from finding unity based on shared exposure to the global capitalist market. Regional or language group consciousness persisted, to which was added increasing class tension between growing rural poor and emergent rural elites, as well as general resentment towards Spanish arrogance and economic parasitism.
Moving on to the system-wide reform, this first started with Spain, which of course extended to their colonies. This is due to the fact that they were facing economic and political instability from participating in the Napoleonic Wars or the Peninsular Wars. This then led on to the war for independence within their own country and the call for the abolition of the monarchy and the removal of church power over civic life. When this intensified, this gave rise to liberal ideologies that then fueled social democratic and socialist organizations. In fact, the Cadiz Constitution was established in 1812 to promote the view that all citizens are equal, including the colonized, before it was disbanded just 2 years after its establishment. Therefore, through this reform, they aim to remove trade restrictions, improve revenue collection, and reorganize government administration. This was, of course, reflected in the Philippines, just like their other colonies, with little to no regard to their respective conditions, thus leading to hardships on our end. The theory was that strengthening the central agencies of the state is the only way to improve governance in accordance with the Ordinances of Good Government released in 1768 and together with the following identified state objectives, which is listed in the PowerPoint. This liberal idea then strayed from the arbitrary rule and called for accountability and the separation of powers of the executive and judiciary branch. It was in Rafael Maria de Aguilar's term, which was in 1801 to 1806, wherein some of these mentioned state objectives, the previously mentioned state objectives, were attempted to be incorporated into society and policy due to increasing social unrest from corruption and raids. This attempt included the following measures: the establishment of accounting procedures for secular and parish administration, which was of course opposed by the religious order. Number two, the improvement of local defenses, development of provincial road links, and number three, creation of public works to stabilize and stimulate the economy. However, it is important to note that changes in the Philippines at that time were relatively slow, and it was further complicated by the increasing population of peninsulares dominating the ranks in local governments, because they are at the top of the social hierarchy at that time. The reform advancement then peaked during the 1860s to the 1880s, wherein a council of administration was established to check the power of the governor-general or the executive. Further, a general inspector of public works and board of civil administration were instituted to oversee the collieries and officials and local government-related affairs respectively. But it is also important to note that this responsibility was not properly handled. The problem with reform lies in the notion that centralization and accountability does not go well together. The primary problem was that both executive and judiciary powers were being monopolized by the same office. This neglects the tenet of separation of powers which reform calls for. It was only in 1861, which was believed to be the start of the peak of reform, wherein this was addressed by relieving the governors of their judiciary responsibilities. The state also attempted to regulate the powers of the clergy, however, the latter rejected any limitations on their rule. Now let's move on to provincial and municipal government. The arrangement of the government during this period was that the Spanish alcalde mayor was the highest position for provincial office. By this means that they have both judicial and executive powers. However, due to reform and gradual influence of liberalism in the country, the office of the alcalde mayor was divided into judicial alcalde and civil executive by 1860. However, it is important to note that even if liberalism has somehow penetrated itself in society, it was still heavily monopolized. For instance, even if there is an election of the cabeza de barangay and the gobernadorcillos, which was the principalia, the only qualified voters were the former officials themselves. Moving on, the primary concern and goal of the state at that time was producing high revenue, because the Philippines was expected to aid Spain in recovering from their instability, and this became the standard as to how a governor can be determined whether they are successful or not. However, due to strict demand, the principality officials, the Cabeza de Barangay and the Gobernadorcillo specifically, were receiving the short end of the stick. For instance, they were using their own money to square out the account with the treasury. Failure to do so may lead to imprisonment. This issue is also related to another problem, which is the challenge when it comes to collecting tribute. First, the gradual rise of social unrest because of system changes such as increased amount of tribute and reduced tributary age made collection relatively hard. Second is the unreliability of the tribute list. This is because population count was not practiced and often comes in conflict with the church, since the percentage that the church receives depends on the amount of tribute numbers. The system as to which tributes are or tribute lists are made is flashed on the screen. In an attempt to solutionize this issue, Governor Narciso Claveria released a decree mandating all Filipinos be furnished permanent family names. The system as to how the family names are determined is flashed on the screen as well, which is based on their towns. This task was carried out fairly quickly because it was assigned to the parish friars. This leads to one of the primary reasons why reform cannot fully enter and integrate itself in the country. The clergy was a massive factor to be considered when it comes to talks about societal and policy changes. This is because they are in charge of many tasks involving the society, both micro and macro level. In most provinces, the clergy controls the local offices, wherein local officials becomes dominated and dependent on the affairs. Therefore, reform cannot be fully integrated in society because it opposes the friar rule.
For the education, the interest of the state in teaching the population was left to religious groups. Primary education was administered by parish friars who only permitted religious subjects. They were also opposed to Indians learning to speak and read Spanish, which would provide them access to the friars' education. Secular education was completely ignored with only one public school in Manila in 1830. A royal decree in 1714 creating a secular university was never implemented, and Decree 1702 creating seminaries for natives was only implemented in 1772. In 1836, the government ordered that all towns establish primary schools to teach Spanish, but there's a shortage of competent educators and the local priests were opposed. In the 1840s, the Spanish still believed that Indians should be kept uninformed. Prayer schools were preferred over secular primary schools, and only the sons of the elite could learn Spanish at seminaries to prepare for higher education in Manila. An 1863 degree was also formed because the Philippines was beginning to join in the world economy, which required a qualified workforce. That's why educational system in Manila and the provinces was expanded. This degree required free basic education at the village level and a Spanish language as a primary curriculum, but it was still heavily religious. It also called for the establishment of a men's normal school, the Escuela Normal by the Jesuits in 1865, to produce Spanish instructors, and literacy became required for office holders 2 years later. And by 1886, the country had 2,143 primary schools, and by the 1890s, public secondary schools outside of Manila, including 10 normal schools for women, were opening. The friars saw them as an intrusion on their educational authority. Spain initiated a review of colonial education in 1868, which led in an order for Intramuros Universidad de Santo Tomas, founded by the Dominicans in 1611, to be secularized and renamed the University of the Philippines, but it was successfully resisted. In 1870, university officials added medicine, pharmacy, midwifery, and surgical medicine, although according to Peter Stanley, they still ignored crucial disciplines needed by the new economy. During the 1860s to 1870s, the Philippine society educated itself as private institutions started to open, such as trade schools, night schools, art schools, and schools of commerce. And not only the elites benefited from greater access to education, because in 1900 there were about 1,914 teachers in a population of 6,709,810 students, with a ratio of 1 teacher to 3,500 students. And even if this is low, the literacy was considered comparatively common. Mapping the peripheries, the army began to expand and upgrade significantly during the 19th century, and Manila's fortifications were reinforced. In the early part of the century, state authority in the Grand Cordilleras was still dependent on religious orders, converting tribes to Christianity. The increased presence of the French and British frightened the Spanish, since they were no match for the fast-moving vessels. By the second half of the century, centralizing reforms and technological advances had given the state's aggressive agencies more leverage, and the militarist presence on the Governors-General's Council had enhanced its influence. The colonial states' desire to align state authority with state borders is why they began to surround Grand Cordillera to launch continuous expeditions. This resulted to increase of provinces from 27 in 1810 to 50 in 1859. In the 1840s, Spanish gained more colonial powers because of their acquisition of steam-powered gunboats, and they began destroying Sulu's major trading towns, Balangiga and Georgia, in the late 1840s and 1850s. By the end of the century, the Spanish had destroyed practically all Muslim shipping in the Sulu archipelago, and by 1878 they had finally won capitulation from Sulu. In 1868, the paramilitary police was established to replace a variety of provincial and local militias. They locally recruited troops and had the authority to suppress banditry, rebellion, criminality, and petty civil indiscretions. It became brutal, that is why it created the Filipino memory of military abuse that inspired a later commitment to civil supremacy. However, the Spanish long-awaited unified and relatively pacified archipelago had finally become a reality.
Next is the social formation and state response. The Spanish friars gathered taxes and organized labor for the needs of the colonial state and church. Chinese and Chinese mestizos were established into self-governing municipal corporations under the administration of a provincial governor in Manila and a few other places. Language, distance, and a lack of mobility continued to separate these communities. There was no perceived need to establish a more harmonious society, nor for residents to be touched by more state representatives as long as the cities were supplied by retail networks of necessary Chinese. As Malay Filipinos or Indios and mestizos intermarried, the old structure of local government weakened as they rejected political office and moved beyond the influence of the local friar. The role of Chinese mestizos in this process cannot be neglected because their growth posed a significant challenge to the colonial state. In addition, religion and ethnicity was gradually replaced by commerce, land ownership, and professional status as the foundation of social identity, and these changes had a significant impact on the character of the colonial society. For the continuation of the Philippine societies, newer Chinese immigrants can easily access foreign capital. They also delay their integration and marrying following the overseas Chinese nationalism. They established their own newspapers, schools, cemeteries, and hospitals to reclaim its mestizo children. They were also lumber processors, urban artisans, rural workers, and monopoly contractors, in addition to their traditional responsibilities as wholesalers and retailers. Earlier Spanish mestizos in the countryside were the illegal children of friars, and they were absorbed into Indio communities. Fearing descent on the colonial social ladder, Spanish mestizos, also known as criollos, wanted to claim pure Spanish blood. They constituted a competition for the ruling Spaniards since they are as thriving as the Principalia and Chinese mestizos. In the old socio-economic network, Chinese served as an economic link between the Spaniard and Indios, but it has gradually been replaced by a more dynamic social hierarchy. Rural Hispanization was mediated by friars and further localized as folk Catholicism, which is various ethnic expressions and practices of Catholicism that is intermingled with aspects of folk religion. Filipinized Hispanic culture is what they call a more sophisticated version of Spanish culture in the Philippines. The increased wealth in the economy was mostly associated to land, and the revenue received from it enabled the Indio Mestizo Principalia to increase its cultural wealth. After traveling overseas, the elites were proud to exhibit their wealth by buying large houses, funding church activities, demanding more influence in local decision making, and many more. The wealth and increased education brought with them a desire for social recognition. Ethnic divisions between Chinese, Spanish mestizos, and Indio elites had become outdated and had been replaced by class, culture, and profession based identities. The three groups gravitated toward a commonly shared identity, which they discovered and come up of the term of Filipino that is appropriated from Spanish Criollos. The new Filipino elite had a developing internal class structure even if it has been compared to the rural peasantry. Below the caciques and a middle stratum of inquilinos and merchants was an urban wing of professionals such as doctors, lawyers, etc., and workers such as accountants, clerks, and many more. The reforms they had introduced to deal with economic and social change is not a failure, but maintaining Spain's hold on the Philippines as a colony were increasingly insufficient. The reform highlighted Spanish lack of leadership and dynamism. They also closed ranks rather than admit new clusters and retreated behind fair control. Again, we are the Group 1, and that is all for our topic, State and Societies. Thank you for listening.